19. During the 5 years that had passed since the Russian army invaded Tomash's country, Prague had undergone considerable changes. The people Tomash met in the streets were different. Half of his friends had emigrated, and half of the half that remained had died. For it is a fact which will go unrecorded by historians that the years following the Russian invasion were a period of funerals. The death rate soared. I do not speak only of the cases, rather rare of course, of people hounded to death, like Jan Prokaska, the novelist. 2 weeks after his private conversations were broadcast daily over the radio, he entered the hospital. The cancer that had most likely lain dormant in his body until then suddenly blossomed like a rose. He was operated on in the presence of the police, who, when they realized he was doomed anyway, lost interest in him and let him die in the arms of his wife. But many also died without being directly subjected to persecution. The hopelessness pervading the entire country penetrated the soul to the body, shattering the latter. Some ran desperately from the favor of a regime that wanted to endow them with the honor of displaying them side by side with its new leaders. That is how the poet František Rubin died, fleeing from the love of the party. The Minister of Culture, from whom the poet did everything possible to hide, did not catch up with Rubin until his funeral, when he made a speech over the grave about the poet's love for the Soviet Union. Perhaps he hoped his words would ring so outrageously false that they would wake Rubin from the dead, but the world was too ugly, and no one decided to rise up out of the grave. One day, Tomash went to the crematorium to attend the funeral of a famous biologist who had been thrown out of the university and the Academy of Sciences. The authorities had forbidden mention of the hour of the funeral in the death announcement, fearing that the services would turn into a demonstration. The mourners themselves did not learn until the last moment that the body would be cremated at 6:30 in the morning. Entering the crematorium, Tomash did not understand what was happening. The hall was lit up like a film studio. Looking around in bewilderment, he noticed cameras set up in 3 places. No, it was not television. It was the police. They were filming the funeral to study who had attended it. An old colleague of the dead scientist, still a member of the Academy of Sciences, had been brave enough to make the funeral oration. He had never counted on becoming a film star. When the services were over and everyone had paid his respects to the family of the deceased, Tomash noticed a group of men in one corner of the hall and spotted the tall, stooped editor among them. The sight of him made Tomash feel how much he missed these people who feared nothing and seemed bound by a deep friendship. He started off in the editor's direction with a smile and a greeting on his lips, but when the editor saw him, he said, "Careful, don't come any closer." It was a strange thing to say. Tomash was not sure whether to interpret it as sincere, friendly warning. "Watch out, we're being filmed. If you talk to us, you may be hauled in for another interrogation," or as irony, "If you weren't brave enough to sign the petition, be consistent and don't try the old pals act on us." Whatever the message meant, Tomash heeded it and moved off. He had the feeling that the beautiful woman on the railway platform had not only stepped into the sleeping car, but, just as he was about to tell her how much he admired her, had put her finger over his lips and forbidden him to speak. 20. That afternoon he had another interesting encounter. He was washing the display window of a large shoe shop when a young man came to a halt right next to him, leaned up close to the window, and began scrutinizing the prices. "Prices are up," said Tomash without interrupting his pursuit of the rivulets trickling down the glass. The man looked over at him. He was a hospital colleague of Tomash's, the one I have designated S, the very one who had sneered at Tomash while under the impression that Tomash had written a statement of self-criticism. Tomash was delighted to see him, naively so, as we delight in unexpected events, but what he saw in his former colleague's eyes before S had a chance to pull himself together, was a look of none too pleasant surprise. "How are you?" S asked. Before Tomasz could respond, he realized that S was ashamed of having asked. It was patently ridiculous for a doctor practicing his profession to ask a doctor washing windows how he was. To clear the air, Tomasz came out with a sprightly, a fine, just fine, as he could muster, but he immediately felt that no matter how hard he tried, in fact, because he tried so hard, his fine sounded bitterly ironic, and so he quickly added, "What's new at the hospital?" "Nothing," S answered. "Same as always." His response, too, though meant to be as neutral as possible, was completely inappropriate, and they both knew it. And they both knew it. How can things be the same as always when one of them was washing windows? "How's the chief?" asked Tomasz. "You mean you don't see him?" asked S. "No," said Tomasz. It was true. From the day he left, he had not seen the chief surgeon even once. And they had worked together so well. They had even tended to think of themselves as friends, so no matter how he said it, his no had a sad ring, and Tomasz suspected that S was angry with him for bringing up the subject. Like the chief surgeon, S had never dropped by to ask Tomasz how he was doing or whether he needed anything. All conversation between the two former colleagues had become impossible, even though they both regretted it, Tomasz especially. He was not angry with his colleague for having forgotten him, if only he could make that clear to the young man beside him. What he really wanted to say was, "There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's perfectly normal for our paths not to cross. There's nothing to get upset about. I'm glad to see you." But he was afraid to say it because everything he had said so far failed to come out as intended, and these sincere words too would sound sarcastic to his colleague. "I'm sorry," said S after a long pause. "I'm in a real hurry." He held out his hand. "I'll give you a buzz." During the period when his colleagues turned their noses up at him for his supposed cowardice, they all smiled at him. Now that they could no longer scorn him, now that they were constrained to respect him, they gave him a wide berth. Then again, even his old patients had stopped sending for him, to say nothing of greeting him with champagne. The situation of the déclassé intellectual was no longer exceptional. It had turned into something permanent and unpleasant to confront. 21. He went home, lay down, and fell asleep earlier than usual. An hour later he woke up with stomach pains. They were an odd malady that appeared whenever he was depressed. He opened the medicine chest and let out a curse. It was completely empty. He had forgotten to keep it stocked. He tried to keep the pain under control by force of will and was, in fact, fairly successful, but he could not fall asleep again. When Teresa came home 1:30, he felt like chatting with her. He told her about the funeral, about the editor's refusal to talk to him, and about his encounter with S. "Prague has grown so ugly lately," said Teresa. "I know," said Tomasz. Teresa paused and said softly, "The best thing to do would be to move away." "I agree," said Tomasz, "but there's nowhere to go." He was sitting on the bed in his pajamas, and she came and sat down next to him, putting her arms around his body from the side. "What about the country?" she said. "The country?" he asked, surprised. "We'd be alone there. You wouldn't meet the editor or your colleagues. The people there are different, and we'd be getting back to nature. Nature is the same as it always was." Just then, Tomasz felt another stab in his stomach. It made him feel old, feel that what he longed for more than anything else was peace and quiet. "Maybe you're right," he said with difficulty. The pain made it hard for him to breathe. "We'd have a little house and a little garden, but big enough to give Kiernan room for a decent run." "Yes," said Tomasz. He was trying to picture what it would be like if they did move to the country. He would have difficulty finding a new woman every week. It would mean an end to his erotic adventures. "The only thing is, you'd be bored with me in the country," said Teresa, as if reading his mind. The pain grew more intense. He could not speak. It occurred to him that his womanizing was also something of an Esmus sign, an imperative enslaving him. He longed for a holiday, but for an absolute holiday, a rest from all imperatives, from all Esmus sign. If he could take a rest, a permanent rest, from the hospital operating table, then why not from the world operating table, the one where his imaginary scalpel opened the strong box women use to hide their illusory 1/1,000,000th part dissimilarity? "Your stomach is acting up again," Teresa exclaimed, only then realizing that something was wrong. He nodded. "Have you had your injection?" He shook his head. "I forgot to lay in supply of medication." Though annoyed at his carelessness, she stroked his forehead, which was beaded with sweat from the pain. "I feel a little better now." "Lie down," she said, and covered him with a blanket. She went off to the bathroom, and in a minute was back and lying next to him. Without lifting his head from the pillow, he turned to her and nearly gasped. The grief burning in her eyes was unbearable. "Tell me, Teresa, what's wrong? Something's been going on inside you lately. I can feel it. I know it." "No," she shook her head. "There's nothing wrong. There's no point in denying it. It's the same things," she said. The same things meant her jealousy and his infidelities. But Tomasz would not let up. "No, Teresa. This time it's something different. It's never been this bad before." "Well then, I'll tell you," she said. "Go and wash your hair." He did not understand. The tone of her explanation was sad and antagonistic, almost gentle. "For months now, your hair has had a strong odor to it. It smells of female genitals. I didn't want to tell you, but night after night I've had to breathe in the groin of some mistress of yours." The moment she finished, his stomach began hurting again. He was desperate. The scrubbings he'd put himself through, body, hands, face, to make sure not the slightest trace of their odors remained behind. He'd even avoided their fragrant soaps, carrying his own harsh variety with him at all times. But he'd forgotten about his hair. It had never occurred to him. Then he remembered the woman who had straddled his face and wanted him to make love to her with it, and with the crown of his head. He hated her now. What stupid ideas! He saw there was no use denying it. All he could do was laugh a silly laugh and head for the bathroom to wash his hair. But she stroked his forehead again and said, Stay here in bed. Don't bother washing it out. I'm used to it by now." His stomach was killing him, and he longed for peace and quiet. "I'll write to that patient of mine, the one we met at the spa. Do you know the district where his village is?" "No." Tomasz was having great trouble talking. All he could say was, "Woods, rolling hills." "That's right. That's what we'll do. We'll go away from here. But no talking now." And she kept stroking his forehead. They lay there side by side, neither saying a word. Slowly the pain began to recede. Soon they were both asleep. "22. In the middle of the night, he woke up and realized to his surprise that he had been having one erotic dream after the other. The only one he could recall with any clarity was the last, an enormous naked woman, at least 5 times his size, floating on her back in a pool, her belly from crotch to navel covered with thick hair. Looking at her from the side of the pool, he was greatly excited. How could he have been excited when his body was debilitated by a gastric disorder? And how could he be excited by the sight of a woman who would have repelled him had he seen her while conscious? He thought, in the clockwork of the head, 2 cogwheels turn opposite each other. On the one, images, on the other, the body's reactions. The cog carrying the image of a naked woman meshes with the corresponding erection command cog. But when, for one reason or another, the wheels go out of phase and the excitement cog meshes with a cog bearing the image of a swallow in flight, the penis rises at the sight of a swallow. Moreover, a study by one of Tomash's colleagues, a specialist in human sleep, claimed that during any kind of dream, men have erections, which means that the link between erections and naked women is only one of 1,000 ways the Creator can set the clockwork moving in a man's head. And what has love in common with all this? Nothing. If a cogwheel in Tomash's head goes out of phase and he's excited by seeing a swallow, it has absolutely no effect on his love for Teresa. If excitement is a mechanism our Creator uses for his own amusement, love is something that belongs to us alone and enables us to flee the Creator. Love is our freedom. Love lies beyond Esmus sign. Though that is not entirely true. Even if love is something other than a clockwork of sex that the Creator uses for his own amusement, it is still attached to it. It is attached to it like a tender naked woman to the pendulum of an enormous clock. Tomash thought, attaching love to sex is one of the most bizarre ideas the Creator ever had. He also thought, one way of saving love from the stupidity of sex would be to set the clockwork in our head in such a way as to excite us at the sight of a swallow. And with that sweet thought he started dozing off. But on the very threshold of sleep, in the no man's land of muddled concepts, he was suddenly certain he had just discovered the solution to all riddles, the key to all mysteries, a new utopia, a paradise, a world where man is excited by seeing a swallow and Tomash can love Teresa without being disturbed by the aggressive stupidity of sex. Then he fell asleep. 23. Several half-naked women were trying to wind themselves around him, but he was tired, and to extricate himself from them he opened the door leading to the next room. There, just opposite him, he saw a young woman lying on her side on a couch. She too was half-naked. She wore nothing but panties. Leaning on her elbow, she looked up at him with a smile that said she had known he would come. He went up to her. He was filled with a feeling of unutterable bliss at the thought that he had found her at last and could be there with her. He sat down at her side, said something to her, and she said something back. She radiated calm. Her hand made slow, supple movements. All his life he had longed for the calm of her movements. Feminine calm had eluded him all his life. But just then the dream began its slide back to reality. He found himself back in that no man's land where we are neither asleep nor awake. He was horrified by the prospect of seeing the young woman vanish before his eyes and said to himself, God, how I'd hate to lose her. He tried desperately to remember who she was, where he'd met her, what they'd experienced together. How could he possibly forget when she knew him so well? He promised himself to phone her first thing in the morning. But no sooner had he made the promise than he realized he couldn't keep it. He didn't know her name. How could he forget the name of someone he knew so well? By that time, he was almost completely awake. His eyes were open, and he was asking himself, "Where am I?" "Yes, I'm in Prague. But that woman, does she live here too? Didn't I meet her somewhere else? Could she be from Switzerland?" It took him quite some time to get it into his head that he didn't know the woman, that she wasn't from Prague or Switzerland, that she inhabited his dream and nowhere else. He was so upset he sat up straight up in bed. Teresa was breathing deeply beside him. The woman in the dream, he thought, was unlike any he had ever met. The woman he felt he knew most intimately of all had turned out to be a woman he did not even know. And yet she was the one he had always longed for. If a personal paradise were ever to exist for him, then in that paradise he would have to live by her side. The woman from his dream was the Esmus sign of his love. He suddenly recalled the famous myth from Plato's Symposium. People were hermaphrodites until God split them in two, and now all the halves wander the world over seeking one another. Love is the longing for the half of ourselves we have lost. Let us suppose that such is the case, that somewhere in the world each of us has a partner who once formed part of our body. Tomasz's other part is the young woman he dreamed about. The trouble is, man does not find the other part of himself. Instead, he is sent a Teresa in a bulrush basket. But what happens if he nevertheless later meets the one who was meant for him, the other part of himself? Whom is he to prefer? The woman from the bulrush basket or the woman from Plato's myth? He tried to picture himself living in an ideal world with the young woman from the dream. He sees Teresa walking past the open windows of their ideal house. She is alone and stops to look in at him with an infinitely sad expression in her eyes. He cannot withstand her glance. Again he feels her pain in his own heart. Again he falls prey to compassion as sinks deep into her soul. He leaps out of the window, but she tells him bitterly to stay where he feels happy, making those abrupt angular movements that so annoyed and displeased him. He grabs her nervous hands and presses them between his own to calm them. And he knows that time and again he will abandon the house of his happiness, time and again abandon his paradise and the woman from his dream and betray the Esmus sign of his love to go off with Teresa, the woman born of 6 laughable forturies. All this time he was sitting up in bed and looking at the woman who was lying beside him and holding his hand in her sleep. He felt an ineffable love for her. Her sleep must have been very light at the moment because she opened her eyes and gazed up at him questioningly. "What are you looking at?" she asked. He knew that instead of waking her, he should lull her back to sleep, so he tried to come up with an answer that would plant the image of a new dream in her mind. "I'm looking at the stars," he said. "Don't say you're looking at the stars. That's a lie. You're looking down." "That's because we are in an airplane. The stars are below us." "Oh, in an airplane," said Teresa, squeezing his hand even tighter and falling asleep again. And Tomasz knew that Teresa was looking out of the round window of an airplane flying high above the stars.